The rain had just stopped when Caleb Reyes pulled his truck off the gravel road and parked beneath the old oak at the edge of his grandfather's farm outside Elena, Georgia. It was late April, the mountains still cool in the mornings, mist curling low over the hollows, and the flame azaleas that grew wild along the ridge behind the farmhouse had just begun to bloom, a whole hillside catching fire with red and orange, blossoms that the old-timers around here called the blazing season, the one stretch of the year when the whole mountain seemed to be lit from the inside. Caleb was 33, a stonemason by trade, broad-shouldered and quiet in the way of men who'd grown up working outdoors and never learned to fill silence with unnecessary words. He'd come back to the farm 3 months earlier, after his grandfather's stroke had left the old man in a care facility in town, and the farmhouse standing empty for the first time in 60 years. Caleb had told himself he was only there to fix the place up and sell it, to settle the estate and get back to his life in Atlanta. But something about walking those hills every morning, about the smell of wet pine and turned earth, had slowed the clock down in him in ways he hadn't expected. It was on one of those blazing red mornings that he first saw her. She was standing at the fence line that separated his grandfather's land from the old Whitmore property next door, camera raised, photographing the hillside of flame azaleas with a kind of stillness that made her look like she belonged to the landscape rather than just visiting it. She had light brown hair pulled back in a loose braid, a faded denim jacket over a cream-colored V-neck blouse, and when she lowered the camera and caught him watching her, she didn't look embarrassed. She smiled easy and unbothered, like she'd expected to be seen all along. "Sorry," she said. "I know this is your side of the fence. I used to sneak over here as a kid." "You're a Whitmore," Caleb said, placing her then by the resemblance to old Mrs. Whitmore's photographs was unmistakable. Something in the set of the jaw, the directness of the eyes. "Guilty, Elena Whitmore. My grandmother left me the place last year. I've been meaning to come fix it up for months, and I finally ran out of excuses." She nodded toward the blazing hillside. "I forgot how much I missed this. The flowers. I used to think they only bloomed for me." Caleb laughed before he could stop himself, and something about the sound surprised him. He hadn't laughed easily and longer than he wanted to admit. "They bloom for everybody. Mountain doesn't care whose fence they're on." "Cynic," she said, but she was smiling when she said it. And she lifted her camera again, framing the shot with him standing at the edge of it, half in and half out of the picture. "Don't move. This is a good one." He should have felt self-conscious. Instead, he stood there in the cool morning light and let her take the photograph, some old, careful part of himself loosening for the first time in months. Elena Whitmore turned out to be a landscape photographer based out of Asheville, 30 years old, freelance work for magazines and conservation nonprofits, the kind of career that let her disappear into mountains for weeks at a time and come back with images that made people who'd never left the city ache for wilderness. She told Caleb over the following weeks, because there were following weeks, because the fence line between their properties turned out to be more of a suggestion than a boundary, and that she'd spent her childhood summers on her grandmother's farm and had sworn, at 19, never to come back. Too small, too slow, too far from anything that felt like a future. But her grandmother's death had left her the land and an unexpected weight of grief she hadn't known. She was carrying, and here she was anyway, working through it one photograph at a time. Caleb told her about his grandfather, about the stroke that had taken half his speech and most of his left side, about visiting him every Sunday in the care facility and watching the old man's eyes light up at the mention of the farm, even when the words to ask about it wouldn't come. He told her he'd been planning to sell once probate cleared. Elena went quiet at that, the same particular quiet he'd noticed the day at the fence line, like she was framing a difficult shot in her mind before deciding whether to take it. "You don't want to sell," she said finally. "Not a question. I've got a whole life in Atlanta." "That's not what I asked." He didn't have an answer for that, not one he was ready to say out loud, so he changed the subject and she let him, though he noticed she didn't forget it either. By May, the blazing azaleas had started to fade, replaced by the deeper green of full spring, and Caleb and Elena had fallen into an easy rhythm. Coffee on her grandmother's porch some mornings, help hauling fence posts on his side some afternoons, long evening walks along the ridge while she pointed her camera at things he'd walked past his whole life without really seeing, the particular gold of late light through hickory leaves, the crooked persistence of a fence post that had outlasted 3 generations of Reyes men. She had a way of looking at the mountain that made him feel like he was seeing his own life from the outside for the first time, and he found he didn't mind it. He found he wanted more of it. They fell in love the way mountain weather changes, not suddenly, but so gradually that by the time you notice you're already standing in it, soaked through, and it's too late to pretend you hadn't seen it coming. Caleb kissed her for the first time on the porch of her grandmother's house during a June thunderstorm, both of them laughing at how ridiculous the timing was, lightning cracking somewhere over the ridge, and neither of them pulled away when it should have felt too fast. But summer brought complications the way it always does. Elena's agent called, with an offer that made her hands shake when she read the email. Allowed to Caleb, a year-long assignment, documenting endangered wetlands across 3 continents. The kind of career-defining work she'd have crawled over broken glass for at 25. It would mean leaving in September. It would mean the farm sitting empty again, another inheritance she couldn't quite bring herself to let go of, but couldn't stay for either. Caleb, for his part, had quietly stopped filling out the paperwork to list his grandfather's farm. He'd told himself it was because probate was taking longer than expected, but the truth was simpler and harder to admit. He'd started imagining a version of his life that didn't end in Atlanta, one built instead around this ridge, these hills, the particular way morning fog settled into the hollow behind the barn. He hadn't told Elena that yet. He'd been waiting for the right moment, the way a mason waits for a stone to sit exactly right before he sets it. The right moment came unfairly. On the same evening, she told him about the wetlands assignment, and for a while neither of them said what they were both thinking, which was that they had built something real out of a single accidental season, and now the season was ending. "I don't want you to stay because of me," Elena said, sitting on the porch steps with her knees pulled up, camera forgotten beside her for once. "I've watched people give up things for other people before. It never actually works. Somebody always ends up resenting the other one even if they don't mean to." "I'm not asking you to stay," Caleb said. "I wasn't going to ask you that." "Then what were you going to ask?" He hadn't fully worked it out himself until the words were already leaving his mouth. "I was going to ask if there's a version of this where neither of us has to be the one who gives something up." She looked at him for a long moment, the last of the daylight catching gold in her hair, and didn't answer right away. That was the thing about Elena. She never rushed toward an answer, the same way she never rushed a photograph, waiting instead for the light to be exactly right. They didn't solve it that night. Caleb drove his grandfather's stroke recovery timeline and his own half-formed plans back to Atlanta the next morning, turning the question over during the whole 4-hour drive. And it wasn't until he sat across from his grandfather in the care facility, watching the old man struggle to form the word farm, that something clicked loose in him. His grandfather had built a life on that mountain, not because it was easy or convenient, but because it was the place he'd chosen to keep choosing, year after year, blazing season after blazing season. Caleb understood, watching him, that he wanted the same kind of life, not one built around staying still, but one built around a place worth returning to, no matter how far the roads led away from it in between. He called Elena that night and told her he wasn't selling the farm, and he wasn't asking her to give up the wetlands assignment either. He told her he'd learned enough about restoration work over the last few months, repairing his grandfather's barn, rebuilding stone walls that had crumbled over 60 winters, that he could likely find contract masonry work almost anywhere, including near whatever base camp her assignment required. He told her he wasn't asking to come with her forever. He was asking if there was room, this once, for both of their futures to bend toward each other instead of away. Elena was quiet on the phone long enough that Caleb thought the call had dropped. Then she said, "You'd really do that? Leave the farm sitting empty again?" "Not empty," Caleb said. "Waiting. There's a difference. It waited 60 years for my grandfather to come home from Korea. It can wait 1 more year for us." She cried on the phone, which she told him later she almost never did, the same way she'd told him she almost Never let anyone photograph her instead of the other way around. And by August they had a plan neither of them had expected to want. Elena would take the assignment. Caleb would join her for the parts of it based in reachable regions, picking up stonework and restoration contracts wherever wetlands. Conservation crews needed old barns and boundary walls rebuilt, and they would come back to the mountain together the following spring. In time for the blazing season, no matter which continent they were standing on when the year turned. They left Georgia in September, and the year that followed took them through marshland in Louisiana, through the fog-heavy wetlands of coastal Oregon, through a bitter cold February in a research station on the edge of a Chilean estuary where Caleb learned to lay stone in weather that made Georgia winters feel gentle by comparison. It wasn't easy. There were fights, there were months apart when contract work pulled. Caleb one direction and Elena's assignment pulled her another. And there was a particularly hard week in November when Caleb's grandfather had a second, smaller stroke, and Caleb flew home alone not knowing if the old man would still be there when he landed. He was diminished, but there. And something about walking into that hospital room and finding his grandfather still fighting made Caleb understand all over again exactly what he was building toward. They kept a promise between them that whatever else happened, they would be back on the Georgia Ridge by the last week of April, when the flame azaleas caught fire on the hillside behind the farmhouse. Elena's assignment wrapped in mid-April. 3 continents and 11 wetland sites, documented into a body of work that would eventually win her the most prestigious award of her career, though neither of them knew that yet. The morning they drove back up the gravel road together, the old oak still standing sentinel at the property line, the hillside behind the farmhouse just beginning to blaze red at the edges. Caleb's grandfather had been moved by then into a smaller assisted living cottage closer to town, well enough to sit on a porch again, well enough to ask haltingly, but clearly about the farm, about the blazing hillside, about whether the boy had finally figured out what mattered. Caleb brought him up to the ridge that week in a wheelchair. Elena helped push over the uneven ground, and the old man sat looking at the hillside on fire with color, his weathered hand finding Elena's without needing to be introduced properly, as if he'd known all along she'd be the one standing beside his grandson when the blossoms came back. Caleb proposed to her that same evening, at the exact fence line where he'd first seen her. Lift a camera to a hillside she thought bloomed only for her, and he told her the truth as plainly as he knew how, that the flowers didn't remember her name, not really, not the way people like to say about things they loved, but he did. He would every blazing season for the rest of his life, whichever mountain or marsh or shoreline they happened to be standing on when the flowers came back, red as fire, insisting on themselves, the same stubborn way she had insisted on staying in his life, instead of quietly disappearing into someone else's. Elena said yes with her camera still hanging around her neck, forgotten for once, and when Caleb kissed her, the flame azaleas were blazing red all down the hillside behind them, exactly the way they had the first morning she'd stood at that fence and sworn, laughing, that the mountain bloomed just for her. And now, finally, in the truest way either of them understood, it did.